All right, welcome back to another episode. In the previous episode, we had a mostly functioning calculator app that was actually letting us type in some numbers and looked actually pretty close to what the final project's going to be. Now, in this episode, we're going to go ahead and continue down this path. We're going to modify this a little bit. Now, if you remember, the last time what we left off with was being able to type in a number and it showed that number at the top of the display, which is pretty close to what we want. But for an actual calculator app, we don't want it to just replace. We want it to append to the end of the number. So in this case, if I typed the number 6 and then I typed 5, I would expect it to turn into 65. It appends the 5 after the 6. So we're going to start up here with our variable that we've been using to track our number. Now currently, our user input is being tracked as a double, which is useful, and that is actually what we want eventually because we're going to be doing math on it. But in this case, what the user's typing is much more similar to keyboard input, where they can type and it just kind of tacks onto the end, just like you'd expect when you're typing in a text file. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and change this to a string, and since the user hasn't typed anything at the beginning, we're going to assign it to be an empty string to start with. Now you'll see this immediately causes errors all over our file, and you can even see from the error that it's because you can't have a number and a string be assigned to the same thing. So in this case, an int assigned to a string. So we could go through every single one of these and put quotation marks around it, and that would turn these integers into strings. But the problem that this would cause is that it would be the exact same behavior, and we're trying to fix the problem here by turning it to a string. The other thing here is we kind of have this problem of we're just copying and pasting code over and over and over again, and we can fix that. That's the beauty of programming, is that if we use functions correctly, we can make it so that functionality that's repeated over and over can be moved to one place. So let's do that now. We're going to go ahead and we're going to come up here to the top and we're going to create a new function. Now, this function is going to be called add user input, and it's going to take in one parameter that is called input, and it's a string. And what this is going to do is it's going to add whatever the user just typed in to our existing user input. So what we're going to do is we're going to take self.userInput, and we're going to use a function called append, and that will just add on another string to the end of our existing string. So it takes this new input and adds it on to the end of our existing input. So back to the original problem of it turns our 6 and a 5 into 65 by appending them onto the end of each other. Now, the other cool thing that we can do here, since we're going to replace some lines of code, why not replace all of this duplicate code? So let's put self.showUserInput in this function as well, since we always are going to want to update what we're showing to the user after they've typed in some new input. So now we're going to go through here. We're going to replace these 2 lines of code with 1 line of code everywhere, and this is going to end up reducing our total code by, probably 9 lines of code, which doesn't seem like a ton. But over the course of this lesson and the next one, we're going to add a lot more functionality to this. And every time we add more functionality to the add user input, that is more lines of code that we're going to save. So, saving 9 lines of code could quickly turn into hundreds of lines of code just with a little bit of functionality. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to do this everywhere. So when I say that we're going to benefit from this, let's talk about what we're going to benefit from immediately. And that's that the calculator app on iOS doesn't actually let you just type whatever you want. There are certain restrictions on what you can and can't type and how much you can type. And so that's the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to make it so that your user input gets restricted based on a few simple rules. So really quick, let's just make sure that this all works well. We're going to make sure that when we for example, hit our 0 button, that it calls add user input, it passes in the string 0, and then up here in add user input, it appends it to the end of our existing text, and then it shows it to the user. So let's go ahead, we're going to come up here and run this. And you can see it shows label like it did before. Now if I come down here and I press 1 and then I press 0, we get 10 instead of the 0 just replacing the 1, which is awesome. This is exactly what we want. Now let's go ahead, let's fix that label being shown at the top here. Now we have this function show user input which updates our text based on what the user has typed in. So let's go ahead and we're going to do show user input up here right when the view loads. And that'll make it so that we use the same code that updates our text everywhere to display the correct text, even when the view or the app has just loaded. Now, it's showing up blank as expected. The user input was an empty string when we started. But we can go ahead and we can make this make a little bit more sense to our user here. And in our show user input, we can go ahead and introduce what's called an if statement. Now, for those of you that know programming, you're already familiar with this, but this is a beginner tutorial. And an if statement lets you do different code based on certain conditions that have been met. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and type if, that's the keyword. And I'm going to say if our user input, so self.user input, equals an empty string. So if the user hasn't typed anything at all, we don't have anything for the user input. Now you'll notice here we're using a double equal sign instead of a single equal sign, and this is really common in programming. You can't use the same symbol to do two different things. So in this case, one equal sign assigns a value to a variable, and the double equal sign compares two values to see if they're equal to each other or not. So in this case, if our current user input is equal to the empty string, which it will be when they haven't typed anything, then what we're going to do is we're going to say self.userinputLabel.text equals 0. You can see that's just the same as the line below, but instead of showing our user input, which would be empty at this point, it's going to show 0. Let's go ahead and cut this out using Command X and Command V to paste it up here. And now we have an if that does two different things depending on if the user input is empty. And we can even go ahead and throw a comment. We learned about comments last time. So if you throw a comment up here, it says, if there's no user input, show 0 instead. And this will help us remember why we had this if statement up here at the beginning. And you can see that when we run the app, it's doing exactly that. Before the user's typed anything, we have a 0 displayed at the top, which is awesome. That's exactly what we want. So one other thing that's a restriction in the normal iOS app is that you can't just type as many numbers as you want. It actually caps you at 9. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and make it so that when you tap on one of these buttons to type, if you've already typed 9 characters, that it doesn't let you type anymore. Now we could go through and add that to every single one of these functions, but that's why we wrapped all of this functionality in this add user input function. And that's because we knew that all of these are going to behave exactly the same. So here we are, we're going to be benefiting from moving our logic into a function right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with self.userinput.count. Now count is a variable on a string that lets you count how many characters a string has in it. So in this case, we can go ahead and say if self.userinput.count is equal to 9, then return. Now we've used return before, and previously we used it to hand a value back out of a function, but this function doesn't have a return value. It doesn't hand anything back out. So when you do that, you just have a return with nothing after it, and that ends the function early. And so in this case, if self.userinput has 9 characters, then return early. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and just show the user input. We're going to append to it just like we did previously. And you can see this in action here. We can type up to 9 characters, but once we get to 9 characters, it won't let us go anymore. So that's pretty awesome. Now, we've already unveiled the next problem that we want to solve, and that's that it turns into this ellipsis, this ... here at the end, when the text gets too big to fit on screen. And we could actually change that behavior. So let's go back over here to our storyboard. If we go back in here to our storyboard, we click on our label, and then we're going to come up here and open our right panel where we have our properties for our label. And if we scroll down here a little bit, you can see there's something called auto shrink. And this is a behavior you can enable that either lets your text shrink to a certain size or a certain scale. Now in this case, if we knew the exact font size that we wanted to say this is the minimum font size, we could do that. But in this case, we're going to go ahead and pick scale. In this case, we're going to say, well, we want our text to shrink, at most to half size. That's the smallest that we want our text to be able to shrink to. So now if we come up here and we run again, you can see that we can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then every number after that is prevented, and our text is shrunk slightly to accommodate that 9th number. So this is storyboard property, our auto shrink property, playing nicely with our code to get this really nice behavior where the text always shows, but also doesn't let us type too many numbers where the text would shrink just a ton. All right, so let's go ahead and let's add decimal places. That's a button that we don't have really doing anything yet. And the reason we're picking decimal places is basically the same here. We're going to go ahead and do add user input. And in this case, the user is typing in a decimal, and there's nothing else. It'd be a little bit more work if we were still using a double, but because we're treating this as a string and we're just appending stuff onto it, we can go ahead and type 1.35, and it just works exactly like we'd expected, which is awesome. Now, there's one problem here, and that's that we can type as many decimal places as we want, because up until this gets converted into a number, this is just a string, and users can type any text on a keyboard they want. So let's go ahead and let's limit that. Let's make it so it actually makes sense as a number up here. So we already have this check to see if the user has typed 9 characters. Let's add another if here. So if self.userInput, and this is a function on strings, you can check to see if a user input contains a character or a string. So we can say if self.userInput contains a decimal place. Now, if we did this by itself, this just says if the user input ever contains a period, then stop, which is not what we want. That means you can't type after you've typed a period. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce what is called an and. So you can say, well, our if requires 2 things. So in this case, if self.userInput contains a period already, and the input, which is the input that's being passed into this function, is equal to the decimal point, then that means that you return. So if somebody is typing in an input, if we've passed the input of a decimal place into this function, and the user input already has a decimal place, then return. So exit this function early. And we can actually see how this affects it. Let's run it. We can type 1.2, and then the next time we press a decimal place, nothing happens. And that's because our if statement is ending before we get to the append, which is awesome. That limits the number of decimal places, and it makes it so that we get something that actually is a logical number. All right, so that's going to be it for this episode. In our next episode, we're actually going to finish our calculator app. We're going to implement all the arithmetic functions and make sure all of our other buttons are working properly. And then in the episode after that, we'll be doing a little cleanup where we're just going to go through and we're just going to polish things and give you a little taste of things to come. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode. All right, we'll catch you later.